Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to everybody for tonight's show featuring Brother Nizam Ghafoor and KingsServant. We'll be discussing a very important topic in regards to Muslim dialogue on the status of Christ. Who was Jesus, upon whom be peace? And specifically, we'll be examining particular verses in reference to this topic. And the verse in question is John chapter 8, verse 58. The very well-known saying, before Abraham was, I am, which is mentioned in certain versions of the New Testament. So both gentlemen will be going forward and presenting what stand that they take in reference to this. So I think we can just, without further ado, just go straight into it. Between you two, I think, who decided to go first between you two for your basic statement? Yeah, you're muted, Nazam.
I think it was probably me.
I was going to say I thought it was me, but
Okay.
Go ahead.
That's fine.
do you want me to go first, King, or?
Yeah, you go first. That's fine. That's great.
Okay, cool. Okay. So Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulullah Kareem. I begin by God's name. I send praises to our Creator, and I ask Him to send peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad and upon Jesus and upon all His noble servants. The topic is John 8:58, which is the famous verse which commonly comes up in Muslim Christian dialogue, where Jesus is reported to have said in John's Gospel, truly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. So the common interpretation that even I found that even critical, like biblical scholars take, is that here Jesus is claiming to be God, or here he's claiming to be the great I am. And where people get this understanding from is from the Old Testament, from the book of Exodus in chapter 3, verse 14, where Moses, when he asked God for his name, God says, I am that I am, or I will be what I will be. This is a curious statement because here Moses wants to know, who should I say have sent me? And so God responds by saying, I am what I am. And some interpreters, such as the New Jerusalem Bible, in its footnote, as well as Karen Armstrong in her book, a History of God, they make mention that this could be understood in a way in which God is telling Moses, never mind what my name is, or mind your own business. This is like saying, the example that Karen Armstrong gives is like in the Bible. I wasn't able to locate this verse, but in the Bible it says something like, they went where they went. So when God says, I am that I am, it's like saying they went where they went. In other words, that the speaker doesn't actually know where they went. And so when God says, I am that I am, God is saying, never mind what my name is, just say, I have sent you. But nonetheless, if you carry on reading Exodus chapter 3, I believe it's around verse 17 or 18, God tells Moses his name is Yahweh. But going back to verse 14, when God says, I am that I am, there's an alternative translation to this verse. So if you, for example, pick up the New International Version, which is a famous evangelical translation, even though they translate it as I am that I am, in the footnote, they make they highlight this alternative translation, which is I will be what I will be. And this, in my study, seems to be a more accurate translation, because if you look in the grammar of the Hebrew, the verbs are like imperfect and they refer to a future tense. And so this is why you have Robert Alter, a Jewish translation of the Old Testament, as well as the Stone Edition, which is another translation, a mainstream translation to the Old Testament, and also translation done by Everett Fox. All of them and many Jewish translation translate Exodus 3:14 as I will be what I will be, because this seems to be a more accurate translation than I am that I am. So that seems to like undermine the point that if that Jesus is claiming to be the great I am, because it doesn't appear that God ever said in the Old Testament that his name is I am. And also, when we look at the translation of the Greek, which is like an ancient translation, which is referred to as the Septuagint, which was done roughly 200 to 300 years before Christ, they translated into Greek Exodus 3:14 as ego eimi ho on. So Jesus says in John 8:58, ego eimi, but he doesn't say ego eimi ho on. And so what does ho on mean? Ho on refers to the one being, or the self-existing one. And so nowhere in the New Testament is Jesus ever called the whole on, or Jesus himself refers to himself as the whole on. But what's interesting is that in the Greek New Testament, God the Father, he is referred to as whole on, but Jesus in the New Testament is never referred to as whole on. So if the gospel writer John wanted to present Jesus as claiming to be God, you would have expected, and John had Exodus 3:14 in mind, you would have expected John to have used the exact phrasing that's found in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And this is why you have scholars such as C.K. Barrett. C.K. Barrett, in his commentary to John's Gospel, um, this one in particular, on page 342 and also on page 352, he says that when it comes to the ego eimi, or the I am sayings, in none of these I am sayings is Jesus ever equating himself with the Old Testament God. And with regards to John 8:58 on page 352, he says that there's no allusion to Exodus 3:14, and I agree with him. Um, and uh, so what? Then what does John 8:58 mean? So from the context, in my understanding, is that Jesus is debating the Jews, and the argument between him and the Jews isn't to do with whether he's claiming to be God, but the argument is about Abraham. Abraham seeing the days of the Messiah, and so the Jews ask him, how can you have seen Abraham when you're not even 50? But notice that this was their own misunderstanding of what Jesus said, because Jesus never said he saw Abraham, but he said specifically that Abraham saw his days, saw the coming of the Messiah. And this is common throughout John's gospel. You have a common theme of misunderstanding. Like Jesus, for example, in John speaks about his resurrection. He refers to his body as the temple, but the Jews misunderstand him and think that he's speaking about the destruction of the temple. And even in this particular chapter, in John chapter 8, I believe it's verse 27 and 43. It says that the Jews misunderstood what Jesus was saying. For example, there was Jesus was speaking about the Father, but they thought something else. And so this is a common theme in John's Gospel. The Jews constantly misunderstand Jesus. So likewise, when Jesus says that Abraham saw his day, they misunderstand him for Jesus having seen Abraham. But what Jesus is saying in this context is that that the Messiah was ordained, or was in the purpose and plans of God. And so he's claiming to be the Messiah before Abraham came into existence. I am he, meaning the Messiah. And we know this because Jesus uses the same expression, I am he, elsewhere in John's Gospel. In John chapter 4, I believe it's verse 26, to the Samaritan woman at the well, when she speaks about that she's waiting for the Messiah to come. And then Jesus responds by saying, ego eimi, I am he, or I am the one. Um, and this is the first time in which in John's Gospel does the expression ego eimi appears on Jesus's lips. Ego eimi is just
one more minute, Nazam. 1 more minute, please.
Thank you. So ego eimi is just a simple affirmative expression. it sometimes appears on Jesus's lips with a predicate, but when it appears by itself, like in John chapter 4, verse 26, the reference is to himself being the Messiah. And so when Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, it was within the context of affirming that he is the Messiah, that the Messiah was ordained or pre-existed before the coming of Prophet Abraham.
Thank you very much. So I think that lasted a bit more than 5 minutes, but I think we're rather free flowing. It doesn't have to be.
Oh, sorry, I
regimented.
thought it was 10 minutes,
No,
but no, it's fine.
no,
5
that's
minutes.
fine.
I should have read the bottom. So, yeah.
No, that's fine. No, that's fine. That's
Okay,
fine.
cool.
I'm sure we're going to give the equal time to KingsServant. So KingsServant, when you're ready, we're going to do the full 10-minute walk. So go ahead when you're ready. KingsServant.
Yeah, thank you. There we go. So, of course, tonight's discussion is on what exactly Jesus means in John chapter 8, verse 58, where he says, before Abraham was, I am. And as a result, the Jews pick up stones to stone him to death in the next verse. I think in order to understand what the Jews rightly understood Jesus to be saying, we need to go back to earlier in the verse where he actually is speaking to these same Jews, the end of a prolonged debate, where he essentially says to them, you claim that you belong to Abraham, that you're his sons, then you need to act like him, because you were trying to kill me, a man who has told you the truth from God. But this isn't something that Abraham did. Abraham didn't try to kill Jesus like the Jews did. That in itself implies pre-existence to begin with. And we have to ask ourselves, what incident in Abraham's life is Jesus referring to? Similarly, when Jesus says, Abraham rejoiced to see my day, he saw it and was glad, the Jews' response to him wasn't to merely understand him to be talking about prophecy or something like that. They say, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Instead of Jesus explaining, oh, you're not understanding what I'm saying, which he does say on other occasions, he instead takes it to a whole new level. He's not just claiming to have seen Abraham. Before Abraham was, literally before Abraham became, I am. And there's a very key contrast here. Abraham became, Jesus is. Jesus did not become. He is eternal. This is the point that Jesus is making. This is why they want to stone him. And there's a lot more to it than that. He is not simply identifying himself as eternal through his own words, which he is doing, but he's also alluding to passages in the Greek Old Testament, that is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. The Greek translation was more common in those days than was the Hebrew itself, which state in Psalm 90 verse 2, for example, before the mountains became, you are. This is Moses' prayer to God. It's exactly the same contrast, apart from Jesus is saying it about himself and Abraham. Similarly, in Isaiah, where God is drawing a contrast between himself and false gods, he uses this phrase, I am, as a replacement for the phrase, I am God, quite literally. If we turn to my copy of the Greek Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 43 and verse 10, be ye my witnesses, and I too am a witness, saith the Lord God, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe and understand that I am. Before me there was no other God, and after me there shall be none. This is the Greek translation of God's choice words to emphasize that he is the only God, that there is no God like him. He is Jehovah. He is the only true God. I am. And this is what Jesus is alluding to, along with quoting, or I should say making the same distinction that Moses makes in his prayer to God in Psalm 90 verse 2, the mountains became, you are. Jesus is taking this upon himself. Abraham became, I am. He's claiming timelessness for himself, and he is using the same word for himself, the same phrase, ego eimi, that is used by God, not only in Isaiah, multiple places in Isaiah, I won't get into them all right now, also in Deuteronomy, that God chooses to emphasize his unique deity as opposed to false gods or anything else that calls itself God. This is why they wanted to stone Jesus, and this is why we should worship him. Thank you.
So thank you very much, KingsServant, for your useful information that has been imparted. So we're going to come into the next now segment of the show, which I think would essentially just be a slight variation on what we were mentioning, which is in essence just to go into a discussion back and forth. Perhaps Nazam can, just start off by asking for the points that KingsServant has made in reference to the passages from Isaiah, the I am statements, which seek to elude evidence of Jesus also being the I am. So this is the evidence that Isaiah, the KingsServant has brought forward. What do you want to highlight? I'd like to ask KingsServant, and on that basis, a free-flowing discussion can commence.
Yes, so God does say, like, I am besides me, there is no other God. In Isaiah, neither was there a God before me, and nor shall there be another God after me. And who was with me when I created the heavens and the earth, and so on. In fact, Isaiah is one of the most monotheistic books in the Bible. But Jesus doesn't just say, like, isn't the only one who uses this expression I am, but it's a common expression. So you'll find, for example, John the Baptist's lips, on his lips, the expression I am. And you'll find the disciples as well. For example, when Jesus says to the disciples that one of you are going to betray me, and they're asking, is it me? Is it him? And so in the Greek, it's ego eimi, for is it me? Or the blind man that Jesus heals in the next chapter, in John chapter 9, verse 9, when they asked him, are you the blind man whom Jesus heals? And he says, ego eimi, I am he. Or even Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, I believe it's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 15, where Paul says, by God's grace, I am that I am, or something like this. So I am itself is a common expression, and it doesn't appear to be a name for anyone, let alone God. And John, the purpose or reason for writing his gospel is not to prove that Jesus' name is I am, but he's in John chapter 20, verse 31, he tells us that he wrote his gospel so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, not that his name is I am or he's God.
Well, I mean, for starters, we need to understand from the rest of the Gospel of John what John means when he calls Jesus the Son of God. And that is going to be based on everything that came before it. When he says that I'm writing these things so that you may know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. To understand what he means when he calls Jesus the Son of God, we need to read the rest of the gospel that comes before it. And I think this is the same problem that you have when you can rightly point out that the phrase ego eimi can be used by other people and it doesn't imply deity. The fact is, it doesn't imply deity in those contexts. When we are simply looking at two Greek words, ego eimi, in isolation, they can mean a lot of different things depending on the context. In order to know what it means in John 8:58, we need to look at the context of him saying that. We need to look at the discussion about Abraham not trying to kill him, Abraham rejoicing to see his day, him saying that Abraham became, but he is. The contrast that he's making to Abraham, and simultaneously with making that contrast, the allusion he's making to Psalm 90, the prayer of Moses, the mountains become came, God is. And when we do that, we can see why he is in fact claiming to be God here. And he may not be necessarily making the same claim in John chapter 4 when he does say that. Although there are other verses in which he uses the same phrase and does ascribe deity to himself. John 6, Matthew 14, Mark 14. Many times he uses this phrase and it does imply deity. And you can tell by the reaction by the people around him. But that's not to say it has to mean that every time it's used. It depends on the context.
Yes, so I agree with it in terms of the sonship. Like we have to see how the title Son of God is used for Jesus in John's Gospel, and it does seem that the title Son of God, at least in John chapter 20, verse 31, is being used as a messianic title because he puts it next to Christ, as if these two are interchangeable. And this reminds me like of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the title Son of God and Christ are both used interchangeably, where Son of God is like another way of saying that he's the Christ or the Messiah. And that also seems to be the usage in the other Gospels as well, that the title Son of God is like another way of referring to Jesus as the Messiah or the Christ. Although in John's Gospel, it becomes more of an exclusive title for Jesus, whereas in the synoptics it is used for others as well, who are like beloved or righteous servants of God. But in terms of the Jewish reactions of them picking up stones to stone Jesus, this isn't the first time that this has happened, because even Jesus makes mention that how they stoned other prophets that were sent to them, not because any one of them ever claimed to be God, but simply because, like as Jesus says in the same chapter in John chapter 8, that that your father isn't Abraham, nor is God your father, but your father is the devil, who was a murderer from the beginning, and he is also the father of lies. And he says to them that you seek, your desire is to do the will of your father, which is why Jesus says, "You who are determined to kill me, a man who spoke the truth, which I heard from God." So, in other words, the words that Jesus speaks are not his own words, but is truth which he heard or received from God. And so this is why it says in John 59, in the following verse, that when the Jews picked up stones to stone Jesus, Jesus hid himself, managed to escape and hide himself from the Jews. Now, why would Jesus do that if Jesus truly is God? Because if you're God, then the creation cannot harm you in any way, including picking up stones. So there wouldn't be any need for Jesus to hide himself from his enemies if he's truly God. And also, if we also go back to like Abraham seeing the days of the Messiah, this seems to also tie in with another verse in Hebrews, in the letter of the Hebrews in chapter 11 verse 10, where he makes mention that Abraham by faith looked forward to like the days of this city, or in which the Messiah would be the ruler of. So to me, it does seem that Jesus is speaking about pre-existence, but not necessarily in a literal sense, but more in a notional sense, that he existed in God's knowledge, in power, just like the prophet Jeremiah, when God says to Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, that I chose you as a prophet, even before you were in your mother's womb.
Okay, so let's talk about pre-existence. If we look at the Gospel of John more widely when it comes to pre-existence, you have in John chapter 1, when John the Baptist sees Jesus coming to him, he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." This is what John the Baptist says when he sees Jesus coming to him. This is he of whom I said, after me comes a man who has been ahead of me, for he existed before me. Now, John the Baptist and Jesus were cousins, and John the Baptist was 6 months older than Jesus, according to the flesh. It seems like John is pretty clearly teaching pre-existence of Jesus here. And I mean, we can go on to John 3:13, where Jesus says, no one has ascended into heaven, but he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man, which is, of course, Jesus' favorite title for himself. And, you know, we could go on. There are plenty of other examples where John's gospel very clearly states that Jesus existed before. They don't explicitly state that he's God in these verses. He does explicitly call Jesus God and so on in other verses, and we're discussing one that I think is explicit about that. But the idea that John doesn't teach that Jesus pre-existed, when we have statements like these coming from the same author, I don't think that's at all a reasonable conclusion. I mean, I could comment on how you mentioned about they couldn't kill Jesus by throwing stones at him if he was God. I mean, according to John's gospel, he was crucified, and we all recognize that. That is all Christians. It's throughout the New Testament. But we recognize that Jesus has two natures. And I'm sure you know this. I'm quite surprised to hear you raising such a basic objection, to be honest. That Jesus has a human nature and a divine nature. His human nature could suffer death. In fact, that's why he took a human nature, because as God, existing eternally, without a human body, he could not die. He added to himself a human body so that he could give his human life on the cross as a sacrifice for sin. I'm sure you realize this already. I'm kind of surprised to hear you bring this up, but what do you have to say about pre-existence in the Gospel of John more widely? Isn't it completely in harmony with what we should expect coming before this, for Jesus to be saying that he existed before Abraham in John 8:58, if not something much stronger than that?
Yeah, so I'll take the passage with regards to John the Baptist when John refers to Jesus as being before him in rank and not in like pre-existing or in chronological order. And you'll find that John often uses like symbolic or metaphorical language because he uses this type of language also for the disciples. The disciples also are not of this world and that they were with Jesus from the beginning. So in John chapter 15, verse number 27, Jesus says about the disciples, you are not of this world or you are not from this world. And in verse, John chapter 15, verse 19, rather, he says about the disciples that you are not from this world or not of this world. And in verse 27, he says, you were with me from the beginning. So I take this as kind of like providential type language where language is being used in order to like emphasize something certain, even though it hasn't actually happened in reality. And so the disciples existed in the knowledge of God, in God's plan and purposes. Jeremiah existed in God's knowledge and plan and purposes. And so Jesus is ranked higher than John the Baptist in John's Gospel. And so this is what John means that Jesus came before him. And also when Jesus speaks about the disciples in John chapter 17, verses 20 to 23, he says, the glory that God has given me, I now give this to them. Even though Jesus hadn't yet been glorified because he hadn't yet died or resurrected, but he's speaking about as if the disciples are now already receiving the glory. And you also find elsewhere in the Bible, like in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4, where Jesus speaks about how Christians before the foundation of the world. They were already chosen. And also in the book of Revelation, in chapter 13, verse 9, it speaks about the Lamb of God being slain or being killed before the foundation of the world. So even though that hadn't yet happened, but it's spoken about in God's knowledge or in the providence of God. So pre-existence in the New Testament, and I believe James Dunn has also made this point that none of the New Testament writers believed that Jesus existed in a literal pre-existing state. And also, if you go to the Babylonian Talmud, it makes mention that the Jews, they believed in pre-existence um, for seven items of belief that were created before God created the world. And one of them happens to be the name of the Messiah, as well as the temple, the throne of God, the Garden of Eden, and Yahannam, which is referred to as hell. So the name of the Messiah is one of the things that pre-existed, and in the Babylonian Talmud, it quotes Psalms 72, verse 13, as a proof text to say that the Messiah was conceptualized in God's plan and purposes. So the Bible speaks of the Messiah pre-existing in a non-literal sense rather than in a literal sense.
Well,
Just before, sorry, Kings. Just before you respond to Nazam's points, I mean, what do you think of some of the points he made in regards to your specific request for, the understanding that Nazam has taken in terms of pre-existence, singular points that he made? I mean, what are your views on what he's made mention?
Well, I was about to say, actually, I think that he directly contradicts the text in John chapter 1, verse 30, because the verse says, "This is he of whom I said, after me comes a man who has been ahead of me." Yeah, you can say he has been ahead of me. He's in front of me in terms of he has a greater position than me. But he follows up, "After me comes one who has been ahead of me, for he existed before me." The reason that he comes ahead of him in rank is because he existed before me. This is explicit out of the mouth of John the Baptist. I think that he's having to directly contradict what the text says, and as such, he's not interpreting it properly.
Nazam, can you just respond perhaps to that point that KingsServant has made in terms of his understanding that you've misinterpreted or misrepresented that text?
Yeah, so myself and KingsServant will probably won't agree on this specific point, but in the English Standard Version, the version that I'm using, it refers to as it being in rank. In John chapter 1, verse number 30. This is he of whom I said, after me comes a man who ranks before me because he was before me. So I
Yeah,
understand it
he
like
ranks
in
before me.
status and not.
Sorry.
Yeah, so
I didn't mean to interrupt.
the other reason is also because in John chapter 18 verse number 37, Jesus also says that he was born for this purpose. So Jesus even says that he comes into existence in John's Gospel, Psalm Brother Paul, and also in John chapter 1 verse 14 as well. It does say that the Word became flesh. So within that context, Jesus comes into existence as well.
He becomes flesh. He existed before he became flesh as the Word. I mean, I think that's pretty explicit, right? The Word became flesh. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. This Word is Jesus. And interestingly enough, if you look at verse 3, in the Greek, all things came into being through him, and without him did not anything come into being which has come into being. This is the same language that's being used for Abraham in chapter 8, verse 58. Abraham came into being. Jesus is. It does not say Abraham came into being and Jesus came into being as well. There's the contrast here. Abraham came into being, Jesus is. Before Abraham was, before Abraham became, I am. This is what Jesus is saying. He does not fit into the category of those things which came into being. And John is very deliberately making that point from his prologue, where the Word brings everything into being which comes into being, and then the Word becomes flesh, and the Word speaks in John 8:58, saying, before Abraham came into being, I am. You've got a very consistent theme through the book of John here. And yeah, in verse 30, I've got no problem with the ESV translation. I can't remember exactly what it was off the top of my head, but he comes before me, for he was before me. I think that was what you said. The point is, yeah, he comes before me. He's greater than I am. Why? Because he was before me. There's no other possible way of understanding that text. And that's just one example. I mean, we could go to John 17, verse 5, one I haven't mentioned so far, where Jesus prays, glorify me with the glory which I had with you before the world was. This is just one more example. I mean, there's so much more. John very clearly does understand Jesus pre-existed with God. And I'm arguing as God, not only from John 8:58, but if you want to go there, John 20:28, John 1:1, we could go on for a while, but it's pretty clear. This is what John is teaching. I mean, you have a liberty that Unitarians don't have. You can say, yeah, John's teaching that, but I don't believe it because I'm a Muslim and I believe it's been corrupted, or I don't believe that John actually wrote that. But saying that John's not teaching it, that's just not an option.
What would you like to say in reference to some of the points there, Azam, that KingsServant has made?
Oh, thank you. Yes, so I'm not denying that John teaches the pre-existence of Jesus, but what I'm saying is that John is teaching that Jesus pre-existed in the knowledge and plan and purposes of God. Because even when we look at John chapter 1, verses 1 to 3 that you quoted, it doesn't actually mention Jesus. And the problem with saying that it does say Jesus, you end up equivocating and you end up falling into heresy, in which you end up making John's gospel like a modalist or Sabellian document, where Jesus either is the Father or he is the Trinity. And what I mean by that is that if you say that in the beginning was the Word, and this Word was with God, then who is that God that the Word was with? So if you say it's the Father or the Trinity, then it reads as in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the Father or with the Trinity, and the Word was the Father or was the Trinity. But obviously, you're not saying that. So this is why people understand this verse not to mean that it's claiming that Jesus is equal to God, but it's claiming that the word is godly or divine, and not a second person within the Godhead. Because if you look at the Greek word that is being used for he was at the beginning and nothing was made but that was made through him, in all English translations that were done prior to the King James Bible, they translated the pronoun as neuter gender, as it instead of he. So it was at the beginning, and nothing that was made except it was made through it. So you'll find this, for example, in the Geneva Bible translation, because grammatically it is neuter gender. And also, if you look at the usage of the word logos elsewhere in the Old Testament, it never refers to a person. It always refers to either God's commandment or to scripture or revelation. So, for example, in Psalm 33, it speaks of God creating the heavens and the earth by his word. And even in the New Testament as well, logos or word of God doesn't always refer to Jesus. Sometimes it's used in distinction to Jesus. So, for example, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 9. It makes a distinction between Jesus and the Word of God. And why I'm sticking with that, John is teaching that the Messiah existed in a non-literal sense, is not just the background in which John is written in, that that the Jews had this belief that the Messiah pre-existed in a non-literal sense in the Babylonian Talmud. It refers to the Messiah, the name of the Messiah, pre-existing amongst the 7 things that God created before he created the world. And also in John chapter 18, verse 37, Jesus says, I was born for this purpose. And my final point, and it's the point which I didn't get to raise earlier, is that if you look at John chapter 8, like within that context, in verses 50 and 54, Jesus says to the Jews that he's not seeking he's not seeking to be glorified. He says, if I was to glorify myself, then my glory means nothing. So now, why would Jesus say this if he was getting ready or prepared to present himself as God before the Jews? Why would Jesus say that my glory is nothing if I glorify myself? If Jesus wanted to prove to the Jews that he is God.
Just for that last point that Nazam has made, it seems very apt, perhaps where KingsServant can perhaps look to respond to that latter point and then elaborate on what Nazam has said. Go ahead, KingsServant.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, the reason that he makes these kinds of statements, and you have similar ones in similar contexts in John 5, for example, of my own self I can do nothing, as I hear I judge, and so forth, is because he's the second person of the Trinity, not the first person of the Trinity. There is a hierarchy within the Trinity. They are equal in nature, but they have different roles. So, as such, the Son is sent by the Father. The Son doesn't send the Father. It was the Son who became incarnate, and as an incarnate person, as a man, he found himself obligated as a Jew to obey the law of Moses, which was given to the Jewish people. So he placed himself under the Father willingly. And yet you simultaneously find these kinds of statements that I've referred to and more. We could look, John 5, again, same context in which he said what I referred to. Of my own self I can do nothing. Verse 23, he says, all men must honor the Son even as they honor the Father. He who honors not the Son honors not the one who sent him. It's that even as that people stumble over. They will say, yes, we honor him, but they don't say we honor him just as, even as we honor the Father. They're just not willing to do that. And that is, yeah. I also want to comment on something I saw in the chat, actually. You know, this isn't one I am statement. We're discussing one I am statement. But if you go and watch my debate with Al Yemeni, I made the case that Jesus is God according to the Gospel of Matthew based on Matthew 14 and the I am statement that you find there. You can also find at least 2 cases in Mark's Gospel where Jesus uses I am statements to identify himself as God. In chapter 14 at his trial, and also when he comes walking on the water, which is parallel to John 6 and Matthew 14, which I defended in my debate. So this is a pattern. Jesus repeatedly identifies himself as God in this way. And it's through this that we can understand what Jesus means when he says, if you do not believe that I am, you will die in your sin. If there's any doubt through John 8 up to verse 24, what he means when he says that, by the time we get to verse 58, we know what he means, and they're picking up stone to kill him.
Okay, thank you for those comments, KingsServant. I think anything else you want to discuss in reference to this? Perhaps the latter point or the formal point that KingsServant made, Nazami, in terms of Mark 14:62, where when he makes mention of I am, I think in Mark's Gospel, which I think KingsServant is alluding to the fact that is also evidence of claiming to be divinity based upon that I am statement. What would you like to
when
say
he
in response?
identifies himself as the Son of Man, there's a strong argument that that's a divine figure as well, and combined with the I am statement, etc. There's a lot to be said there.
Okay, Nizam,
Yes, so in Mark chapter 14, verse 62, Jesus simply gives us, he gives an affirmative to a simple question. The question is, are you the Christ or are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus simply says, I am. It's just a simple affirmative. It's just like if you ask me, are you Muslim? And I said, I am. I'm not claiming to be to God just because God also uses the expression I am. Billions and trillions and zillions of people use the expression I am. And you might say, but none of them are stoned to death. But blasphemy doesn't just include claiming to be God, which is blasphemy of the highest order. But blasphemy can also be used in reference to someone falsely, claiming to be a prophet of God, or even falsely claiming to be the Messiah or the Christ. So it does seem that it's within this context that they're picking up stones to stone Jesus in John, because they believe that Jesus is the false Messiah, and hence that was the point of the crucifixion. The crucifixion was to prove that Jesus wasn't the Messiah, which is why they crucified him. So if someone is accused of blasphemy, it doesn't mean that automatically the only blasphemy they commit is claiming to be God. But there's other types of blasphemy. In the book of Acts, it speaks of blasphemy against Moses. So even in the New Testament, one can blaspheme Moses or any saintly or godly person. And John's gospel, Jesus is a subordinate servant of God. John does say that that he that is sent is not greater than the one who sent him, and the servant is not greater than the master. Like I said, the reason John wrote his gospel is to show that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. It's not to show that Jesus is God. And there was some other points that I wanted to respond, that KingsServant made. Sorry, the Son of Man. Yeah. So, Son of Man in Mark's Gospel, Jesus doesn't claim to be the Son of Man in Mark's Gospel, but in Mark's Gospel, Jesus answers in the affirmative that he is the Messiah in Mark chapter 14, verse 62, and then Jesus goes on to prophesy the coming of the Son of Man. And then he says, "You will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds." So Jesus is not claiming to be the Son of Man, but he's prophesying the future coming of the Son of Man. However, in the later Gospels, they make Jesus as the Son of Man, the one whom Jesus prophesies. And this is why if you compare Luke chapter 22, there the Jews don't charge Jesus with blasphemy. There's no blasphemy in Luke chapter 22. So when Jesus said, I am, there the Jews do not charge him with blasphemy. However, in Luke chapter 22, I believe it's verse 69, there Luke changes the Son of Man saying, there it becomes, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand. So it's no longer the Son of Man is coming. So Luke has removed the phrase coming, but instead the Son of Man is now here. Like from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand. So in Luke's gospel, the Son of Man is Jesus or becomes Jesus. But in Mark, which is commonly believed to be the earliest gospel, there Jesus is prophesying the future coming of the Son of Man.
Okay, I would really like to come back on that point, because to say that Jesus isn't the Son of Man in Mark's Gospel, Mark 10 verse 33 has Jesus saying, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles. Mark 10:45, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Mark 9:31, the Son of Man is to be handed over to men. They will kill him, and when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. Now, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Nazam, you're making a mistake in conflating two things together. There is a position held by a very small minority of scholars, which is that the Son of Man refers to two different persons. That in the majority of the Gospel of Mark and the synoptics, other synoptics as well, Jesus uses it to refer to himself, but then for no apparent reason, he refers to a different person as the Son of Man in Mark 14 at his trial. So I assume you're referring to that, which is Bart Ehrman's position. But it's still quite a stretch to try to say that, or he's consistently referring to himself as the Son of Man up until this point, and then he uses the same phrase, and for no apparent reason, the subject of it changes to be referring to somebody else. That sounds like desperation to me. And the Son of Man is a divine figure. There's no real question about that. Scholars have looked into this very, very deeply, and one simple case to be made for it is the fact that the Son of Man comes on the clouds, which the Old Testament states that only Jehovah comes on the clouds. And your brother in Islam, Al-Yemeni, will agree with me that the Son of Man is a divine figure, although he argues he's not exactly Yahweh. Other scholars have stated explicitly that it is Yahweh, including non-Christian scholars, Jewish scholars. But I just wanted to make a few more comments about pre-existence as well, and the fact that this can't be talking about foreknowledge. I think I've demonstrated from the rest of John's Gospel that John doesn't understand Jesus to be merely existing in the foreknowledge of God. Speaking of which, John the Baptist's birth was prophesied as well. He would not be before, Jesus would not be before John in the sense of prophecy or the foreknowledge of God, because John's was prophesied in the Old Testament, Isaiah 40, Malachi 3. John's birth was announced to his parents before he was conceived. If I'm not mistaken, that's in the early chapters of Luke, to Zechariah and Elizabeth. Jesus existed in prophecy too. Jesus' birth was prophesied to his mother and his adoptive father, you might say, Joseph. So there's really no difference between them. But John the Baptist says that he is preferred before me because he existed before me. And not only that, the very statement that Jesus makes, before Abraham was, I am. If he existed merely in the mind and knowledge of God, number one, why did he not say before Abraham was, I was, instead of I am? And number two, that wouldn't put him before Abraham, because like with John the Baptist, they both existed in the mind of God before. So he existed at the same time as Abraham, not before him, according to that. But he says before, and he contrasts Abraham becoming, before Abraham became, I am. Abraham became, I didn't, I just am. This is the contrast that he's making. And you haven't made any comments about how Psalm 90 verse 2 has Moses' prayer to Jehovah using the very same language. Before the mountains became, you, God, you are. Same contrast if you are comparing the Greek translations. So, do you have anything to say about that?
Go ahead,
Yes,
Nizam.
so
I think you're on mute.
okay, yeah. So, with regards to Abraham, it's within the context of the Jesus saying that that Abraham has seen my days, or has seen the days of the Messiah. So, within that context, he says that before Abraham, came into existence or came to be, I am he, or I am the Messiah, the one that was spoken about or prophesied. So possibly, like you made mention, like how John the Baptist is prophesied in the Old Testament. But possibly, like some Christians understood Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, as being a reference to the Messiah. So this would have been long before the coming or the existence of Abraham. So maybe within that context, but also it does seem that at least some Jews, according to the Babylonian Talmud, believe that at least the Messiah was conceptually in God's knowledge within the like the seven things that God created before before God created the cosmos or before God created the world. Um, but with regards to the Son of Man in Mark's Gospel, the title Son of Man is used variously, and there's three types of categories, which Barterman specifies. One is that Jesus' general usage of the title Son of Man, where it's used to refer to people in general and not to anyone specific. The second usage is where Jesus does use the expression Son of Man to refer to himself, where he's speaking about himself in the third person. And you gave the example for that. Another example is when Jesus says, the foxes have their holes, the birds have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to rest his head. So within that context, he's obviously speaking about himself. But there's a third type of usage in which Barterman makes mention that if you didn't already believe that Jesus was the Son of Man, it sounds like as if Jesus is speaking about another Son of Man or a future Son of Man to come. And the example that Bart Ehrman gave was in Mark chapter 8. I believe it's verse 42, where Jesus says, whoever in
There's
this
only 38
generation
verses in Mark
rejects
8.
me. So I beg your pardon?
Oh,
so Mark
I
8,
was saying
verse
there's only
42.
38 verses in Mark 8, but
Oh,
I think
sorry,
it's
I
the
beg
last
your, and
verse,
it's verse
verse 38.
38. Yeah. Jesus says, whoever rejects me in this generation, so shall the Son of Man reject them when he comes. Um, so there, it seems like Jesus is prophesying the future coming of the Son of Man. But the specific example that I gave was in reference to Mark chapter 6, Mark chapter 14, verse 62, that if you compare that same saying of Jesus in Luke chapter 22, I believe it's verse 69, 22, verse 69, there Luke seems to have redacted or revised the same saying in that the Son of Man becomes Jesus, in that from now on you will see the Son of Man seated, whereas in Mark Jesus is prophesying, saying that and you will see the Son of Man coming, not that the Son of Man is now seated, but you will see him coming. And you know the Son of Man, it appears in apocalyptic type literature, and apocalyptic type literature is usually symbolic and metaphorical. So when it speaks about the Son of Man coming in the clouds, it doesn't has to be understood literally, but it could be symbolic, since the Son of Man represents God, and so the Son of Man is God's agent. So this is how I would understand these points.
Okay, that's excellent. So, I mean, going forward there, King Servant, some of Nazam's responses in terms of your specific points about the Son of Man, he's categorized it in three different ways. What do you think the points that he's made there?
Yeah, I mean, this is Bart Ehrman's argument, but in doing so, he's taking one phrase that Jesus very clearly uses of himself consistently and just taking one or two examples when he says this same phrase, Son of Man, and saying he's referring to somebody else. It's kind of nonsensical, really. If you've got an established pattern of Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man, the logical thing to do is to take it that it's referring, that he's continuing to use it to him for himself when he's using it, and you could possibly understand it otherwise if you wanted to, and you didn't know any better. We do know better because he consistently uses it for himself. You know, when we have these statements of the Son of Man came to seek and save and give his life as a ransom for many, and you know, Nazam's admitted this, as Bart Ehrman does, that Jesus consistently, repeatedly refers to himself as the Son of Man. And then he just takes 2 or 3 examples where, you know, you could think that it was referring to somebody else if you didn't know what the rest of the gospel said. And we're expected to pretend like we don't know that Jesus refers to himself this way all the time. And I'm not willing to pretend like I don't know that. You know, I've got the rest of the gospel. I'll use the pattern that's already been presented there.
Okay, I think we've enjoyed this segment of the show. I think it's gone for about 45 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. So what we can do now, just if you could just make some wrap up some thoughts, what you're thinking in terms of a closing statement. You can have 10 minutes each if you so wish, if you want to utilize that time. And then I think we want to bring in some eager people in the audience, perhaps, to pose questions to both of you. So either one of you, either of you feel ready, you can go ahead.
Since you started, Nazam, perhaps you should go first.
Okay. Yes, I want to thank you for the meeting, for agreeing to have the discussion. And this is like maybe our 3rd or 4th time now speaking, and I hope we can continue to have these wonderful dialogues with each other. And I also want to thank Mustafa for hosting the event, for being a brilliant moderator, and also to Brother Mohammed as well for hosting this dialogue. And also thank you for everyone in the chat and everyone who's participated. I hope it's been proven to be beneficial. I mean, I learned something, and I have to go away and maybe do some more research and look at more stuff. But yeah, just to summarize some of the points that have come up. So my initial point is that in Exodus chapter 3:14, God doesn't say that his name is I am, but a more accurate translation seems to be I will be what I will be. And nor does it appear that John wants to present Jesus as claiming to be God from the context, because if John wanted to show that Jesus that Jesus was alluding to Exodus 3:14, then you might expect that John would have used the same expression that appears in Exodus 3:14, the Greek translation, but you don't find that to be the case. Nowhere in the New Testament is Hoon ever used for Jesus, nor does Jesus himself claim to be Hoon, as it says in the Greek. In fact, Hoon is only used for God the Father. Only God the Father is known as the self-existing one. And also, if we look at the context of John 8 as well, there Jesus is arguing or debating with the Jews with regards to who has rights over Abraham, like who truly is a follower of Abraham. And so Jesus says that Abraham rejoiced to see my days. And so the Jews misunderstood Jesus to be saying that Abraham saw him, whereas in fact there was nothing that Jesus said that that he saw Abraham, but rather Abraham saw or rejoiced the coming of the Messiah's day. And so within this context, Jesus says that before Abraham came into existence, that the Messiah was prophesied or believed in. And we know this from extra biblical materials such as the Babylonian Talmud, where the Messiah's name is one of the things that God, according to the Babylonian Talmud, created before he created the cosmos or this world. And also, if we another thing that came up with regards to the Son of Man, which KingsServant reminded me in this last segment, is that in the Son of Man sayings, Jesus never uses this Perusia language, where the Son of Man will return or come back. But it's always prophesied in the coming of the Son of Man in the future, rather than Jesus saying, when I return or when I come back. And likewise, when it comes to John's gospel or any of the other gospels, Jesus, when he speaks of going to the Father, he never says, I am returning to the Father, but he says, I'm going to the Father rather than returning. And this would make sense if Jesus didn't pre-existed in a non-literal sense, but rather that Jesus is now going to the Father. And also we have this type of language being used for others as well in the Bible, such as Christians who haven't yet come into existence. We see this in John chapter 17, verse 20. And also with regards to the disciples receiving the glory, even though Jesus hadn't yet been killed or resurrected, but Jesus speaks about them receiving the glory as if they've already received it. And also in John chapter 15, verses 20, verse 19 and 27, where Jesus says about the disciples that they are not of this world, and that they were with him from the beginning. So this obviously doesn't mean that they literally pre-existed, but this is referring to them existing in the plan and in the knowledge of God. I want to again thank you for listening, and anything that I said wrong was for myself, and may God help us and guide us to that which is true.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nizam, for that short statement and summary. KingsServant, you ready? You can go ahead and maximize your 10 minutes if you so wish.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. So I'd actually like to begin my conclusion by quoting from a blog article dated October the 26th, 2018. To the Jews who do not believe in him, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Abraham lived 1800 years earlier, and Jesus is claiming to have existed before that. Even more than that, he claims for himself the name of God, I am. His Jewish opponents know exactly what he is saying. They pick up stones to execute him for blasphemy. 2 chapters later, he does it again, claiming I and my Father are one. Once again, they break out the stones. Later, to his disciples, he says, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. These teachings of Jesus, that he is a divine, correlate with what John says elsewhere, as we have seen in the prologue. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And in the ending, where Thomas confesses, Jesus is my Lord and my God. Where does Jesus call himself God? For John, Jesus is obviously God, and he says he is. That quote is from Bart Ehrman, by the way. Yes, Bart Ehrman may question some things, but he is not questioning the point of our discussion tonight. For Bart Ehrman, what John teaches in this particular verse is obvious, and to deny it is to deny the obvious. I hope that the audience has been paying enough attention to notice that I didn't build anything that I was saying on Exodus 3:14. What can I say? Everything Nizam said about the use of that term is at least debatably true. And that being the case, I think it is a weak argument to argue that because God states, and by the way, it's the angel of the Lord who states this in Exodus 3, when he is asked what his name is, I am that I am, and Jesus is saying that I am, he is therefore identifying himself with that statement. I do not make that argument. I think it's a weak argument, and I hope that the Christians who are watching will have learned how to show that Jesus is claiming to be God in this verse without referring to Exodus 3:14, because I don't think that it is a strong argument for us to make. But there are strong arguments for us to make, and I hope, with God's help, that I have made them tonight by pointing out the parallel with Psalm 90, verse 2, the prayer of Moses, where he says, before the mountains became, but God, you are. Same contrast Jesus uses. Abraham became, I am. Where God uses this same phrase, ego eimi, according to the Greek translation that would be most commonly known and understood by his listeners, to identify himself as the only true God, in contrast to other false gods. And the same goes for Deuteronomy. We didn't look at it, but we see the same thing happening in Deuteronomy in a very similar context, where God is saying that he is the only God and no one can deliver out of his hand. The very same thing that Jesus refers to himself in John 10, and they stone him again the next time, where he quotes, "No one can deliver out of my hand. I and the Father are one." Then that's the next time they try to stone him 2 chapters later. Jesus is identifying himself as God here. He is identifying himself as knowing Abraham and having interactions with Abraham. He says, "Why are you trying to kill me if you're Abraham's children?" Abraham didn't try to do that. And he doesn't make any attempt to correct them. He raises it up to the next level, takes it to the next level until they pick up stones to stone him and he gets out of there. There's no attempt to correct their misunderstanding. Indeed, there is an attempt to show them successfully that he is claiming something even greater than what they initially thought. And it is with this in mind that we should understand Jesus' statement earlier in the chapter. If you do not believe that I am, you will die in your sins. Jesus uses that phrase consistently, or I should say at least frequently, not only in John, but also in the Synoptic Gospels, to say that he is indeed God. Thank you very much for listening, and it's been a pleasure being here. I'll just say as well, there was somebody who suggested that I should interact with Paul Williams, who was in the stream. If he'd like to reach out to me, I'd be happy to have a conversation with him of some type as well. So I appreciate being here. Thank you very much, folks.
Okay, thank you, KingsServant, for your nice words to Nizam at the end. And with that, we can now conclude the official going back and forth, and we can bring up audience members now who want to come up and ask questions. So I think this is where Brother Muhammad can perhaps send the invites, and we will wait on for questions to our respective guests. So let's just start this. Whoever's in the chat, please don't hesitate to come up, and you will be treated with respect, and then you can pose your question to any of the individuals once you come up. Let's see who is available. Brother Muhammad, are you available to bring people up?
There is a question in the chat already. I don't know.
Yeah, at the moment, we're just linking. We're just pinning the link. So inshallah, the moment someone is going to be in the back chat, we will let you guys know. But in the meantime, yes, I'll highlight some questions that we have in the chat, inshallah.
Perhaps before we highlight those questions, me being the host, I would like to ask a couple of questions, if that's okay. Obviously, the questions should be spread out as much as possible to both the learned speakers. So my question essentially, KingsServant, is in reference to John chapter 4, verse 25, where a woman said, "I know that Messiah called Christ is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." The same Greek word there is used as ego eimi. So you said earlier that these terms are only distinguishable by the context. Over here, we seem to be having the same response to a singular question in which this lady notes that he is the Messiah, which of more significance in John chapter 10, verse 23, when the Jews surround Christ and say to him, "If you are indeed the Messiah, tell us plainly." And then he concurs to that point by saying, "I've already told you so, yet you are not of my sheep." Now, it appears that these phrases are him self-identifying himself as the Messiah foretold. And when he just makes this utterance, "I am he," this is the common phraseology for ego eimi given in other such instances where the term is used. It so happens that the majority of the translations in English only refer to this John 8:58 passage as I am, but the correct translation should be I am he. So based upon these 2 points that are made, firstly from John chapter 10 verse 23, where in the context he's confirmed to be the Messiah that the Jews were rejecting. Also in this passage which I've cited, the lady refers to him as the Messiah, and he confirms that he, and the same Greek word that is used, ego eimi. And lastly, to ratify that point, the conclusion of John's gospel is interesting, because if your surmisation is that Christ is the Almighty God or Yahweh, then why is it that nominally John concludes by stating, and I'm just paraphrasing, I don't have the verse in front of me, but he says, I think it's in John chapter 20 or 21, that I've written all these things that you may know that Jesus is the Messiah sent by God. So one would assume that if that is a conclusion, then that is who he is. So those are the three nominal questions which I've asked for of you.
Sure. So let's begin. I'll try and do it chronologically through John's Gospel. So John chapter 4 was the first one that was asked about, where she asks him if he is the Messiah, and he says, I am. Ego eimi. Now, in this case, what do we have? We have the phrase ego eimi in response to a direct question about, are you this? The context would indicate that when he uses the phrase ego eimi in response to a direct question, are you this? And nobody worships him, nobody says there's blasphemy involved, it would seem that he is probably just identifying himself as the Messiah. The same way that the blind man says, ego eimi, it was me. Yeah, I am. So, nobody's making the claim that every time this phrase is used, it identifies a person as being divine. It's given the context. Given the context, I would say most likely he is simply saying that he is the Messiah there. Having said that, you can make a very strong case, and Daniel Boyarin and even some other Jewish scholars do make this case, that the Messiah was understood to be a divine person in pre-Christian times. So they were actually expecting a divine Messiah. That's a debate for another day, but I would actually be on that side. But nevertheless, given the context, he could be saying he's God and the Messiah, but I wouldn't make that argument. I think in that case, it's probably just a self-identification. We need more context to determine when this is being used in a divine sense. And I've explained the context from John 8:58. There are other contexts as well where the same thing is done. Like I explained in Matthew 14 in my debate with Al Yemeni on does the Gospel of Matthew teach that Jesus is God? That would be another example where he does use that phrase while doing what only God can do and being worshipped immediately afterwards. Now, the next point was from John chapter 10, verse 23. Maybe it's 33, you mean? Yeah, it's not. I think you got the reference wrong, but nevertheless, it's not important. But they ask him, tell us plainly if you are the Messiah. And he continues. Yeah, verse 24, that was it. The Jews then gathered around him and were saying to him, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us openly. Jesus said, I told you. He doesn't use the phrase ego eimi, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, these bear witness of me. And he continues his monologue for a few more verses. And here in verse 28, he says, I give eternal life to them, that is his sheep, and they will never perish ever, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. Now this is referring back to Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 32, verse 29, but do check the reference, where Jehovah God says that I am God and there is no other who can deliver out of my hand, which is actually a case where an I am statement is used in the Greek text there that Jesus is most likely referring to in John 8:58 when he uses the same phrase. But nevertheless, they recognize that he is taking what Jehovah says about himself and saying it about himself along with the Father. No one can deliver out of my Father's hand. No one can deliver out of my hand. I and the Father are one. And that's when they pick up stones to stone him. Not when he says, I told you about being the Messiah, but when he says that no one can deliver out of his hand and his Father's hand, referring to Deuteronomy, where Jehovah says this about himself: I am God, there is no other. Who can deliver out of my hand? I and the Father are one. And that's the next time that they tried to stone him. Then the other question was from the ending of John, which doesn't merely mention him being the Messiah, although it certainly does mention that. These things have I written that you may know. I'm going from memory. I haven't actually got the verse here. That Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. Oh, here we are. I won't misquote it. John chapter 20, verse 31. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. We should understand what the phrase Son of God means, and for that matter, what the phrase Christ means, from the rest of the book. And the most detailed explanation of the term Son of God, according to the Gospel of John, is found in John chapter 5, which includes many texts that are used both by Unitarians and by Christians to make their cases. You have statements about him submitting to the Father and having authority from the Father, along with the statement that all men must honor him even as they honor the Father, and the Jews being upset with him because he was calling himself the Son of God, making himself equal with God. That's what it means for Jesus to be the Son of God, according to the Gospel of John. Yeah, that's the answers that I would give to the three questions that you asked there. I know it was kind of long, but it was a long set of questions, so I hope that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks very much for those responses. I mean, I would like to come back, but as this is a discussion between you and Azam, because normally I don't think you've addressed the point of John 4:20 of this passage where the lady asks, or rather says, you are the Christ, which he concurs. So it appears that the general theme is that he's claiming to be the Messiah. The Jews are reluctant to accept him. He's got that ratified. He ratifies it again in John chapter 10. They seem to be of the opinion that they're looking for any reason to do away with him. So they misconstrue what he's saying, giving them a pretext then to make claims that he's made claims to blasphemy when he hasn't made that claim. Like in John 10, 33, 34, when initially in John 10, 30, when it says the Father and I are one, and the Jews pick up stones to stone him. I do find something a bit odd, KingsServant. Now, if he had claimed to be God at that juncture, when he says the Father and I are one, they pick up stones to stone him. And then Christ, observing what they're doing, says, which of my good works you cast unto me? It does seem rather odd that if he's claiming to be God, he would have realized instantly the reason why they pick up stones to stone me is because I'm making claims to be God. Are you following my line of thinking? So, but then they say it's not for good works that we cast stones at you, but for you, a man claiming to be God. It appears then that Christ has understood the reason why they've picked up stones is because they've misconstrued what I was saying. Initially, his response was, "For which of my good works do you cast stones at me?" But had he claimed to be God, he would have known instantly that the reasons they're picking up stones is because I made a blasphemous statement. But he's totally unclear as to why they're doing it. So then they clarify it's not for good works, but you are a man claiming to be God. Then it appears to me that it resonates with Christ, that they're making claims for him that he hasn't made. And then he further goes on in the subsequent verses to eliminate what they are thinking by saying, is it not written in your scriptures that you are gods? And to whomever the word of God has been sent, that I have said I'm the Son of God. So obviously he's asking them to look at Psalm 82:6, in which people are referred to as those who represent him. So he's saying it in that context. So it does appear to me in generality that he only explicitly identified himself as the Messiah in these verses that we've made mention, and there's nothing there within there. Can you possibly consider the possibility that the Jews are trying to misconstrue what he's saying here in John 8:58 and in John chapter 10 verse 30 for the very reason that they could then have a substantive reason to present to the Roman authorities a reasoning to execute him? Do you think that's possible from the context and the points that I've made?
Well, the interesting thing is that when they do give their reason for executing him to the Romans, they don't use any of this because it's a religious claim that wouldn't stand up in a Roman court. That's why they invent the idea that he is starting a political rebellion. And they say to Pilate, you are no friend of Caesar if you release this man. So they basically blackmail him that if you let this guy go, we can paint it like you're letting go a political opponent to Caesar. They don't use his claims to be God as an excuse to try to kill him when it actually comes down to him getting crucified.
And that's the crux. Sorry to interrupt. That's the crux of the matter, it appears to me. That he's not made that claim. They have, between themselves, cannot identify that he's made the claim. Hence, they make an understanding, are you the Christ? They're not saying, oh, are you God Almighty? And hence, you made that blasphemous claim. So it does appear paradoxically, maybe without you realizing, that this is what has occurred. He's not made the claims to being God, but rather the Messiah. And because between them, in their forced deliberations against him, they can't actually bring tantamount evidence that he's claimed to be God. Hence, the Sanhedrin says, are you the Christ? It doesn't say, are you God Almighty? So that seems to be more of a, within the text of what is happening in this passage. And we can see this in Matthew's Gospel, is that when the same question is asked in Matthew's account, as to who, and then Christ responds, if you say that I am, meaning if you're the ones who are saying I am, I'm not the one saying it. So it appears that Matthew has diverted that point away, and it's that Christ is saying that, oh, I know what your game is. You're going to try to corner me for something I'm not prepared to say. But if you're saying it, then that's you saying it. Are you following what I'm saying, KingsServant?
Well, to leave the point about Matthew's gospel aside for the time being, which I did cover in my debate with Al Yemeni, and I can come back to that, but just to focus on John's gospel for now. If we know John's gospel as a whole, we can see that this isn't the theme that John's gospel has. Like Bart Ehrman pointed out, he starts off by calling the word God, saying that nothing has come into being except what came into being through him. The word becomes flesh and dwells among us. And then throughout John's gospel, you have these back and forths with the Jews where he claims to be the Son of God. They want to kill him. He makes that statement, before Abraham was, I am, which, I mean, I have argued, and I think by the grace of God successfully, that it can only be a divine claim. He's making the same distinction made by Moses in Psalm 90 verse 2 about God. The mountains became, God is, and so much else that has already been discussed. And then when we get to John chapter 10, as I pointed out, in verse 28, he is alluding to this Old Testament passage, again from Moses in Deuteronomy. No one can deliver out of my hand. I am the only God. They want to kill him. Yes, there is a rebuttal to that is made both by the Jews and by Jesus. You know, he says, which good work will you stone me for? They say, for good work we don't stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. And then he refers to Psalm 82. And by the end of the discussion, verse 39, therefore they were seeking again to seize him. And he eluded their grasp. And eventually, of course, they did successfully capture him to kill him, but they took him to the Romans. The only way they could get the Romans to kill him was not using a religious claim to be God, because they have no case to make in a Roman court. To say you're a god is nothing to the Romans. It is if you claim to be Yahweh to the Jews, but to say you're a god, they don't care. They just care about money and power. But so they paint him as a threat to the Roman Empire, as starting a rebellion. That's how they managed to kill him. And this is, if you know John's Gospel, including 8:58, the whole thing, right? Thomas declaring to Jesus, my Lord and my God, you will not get that impression of what's being said. It's only by knowing selected verses here and there and, ignoring the Gospel as a whole in its teaching that a person can reach those kinds of conclusions. I would say even ignoring the chapter as a whole. I think any single chapter that we're discussing would be enough to demonstrate that point.
I think as you were explaining that, KingsServant, you may have inadvertently realized, with due respect, an error with what you were saying, because you seem to skip what actually Christ said. Is it not written in your scriptures that you are gods? So he's actually saying that those who do God's work are referred to as gods. So in this context, what's the issue with me being known? The first is in that same chapter that whatever, for a want of a phraseology, just paraphrasing, he's basically saying, so if I've claimed to be a son of God in that context, then what is your issue with me having that title? Because you are also referred to that title according to Psalm 82:6. So it appeared to me when you answer that question that you inadvertently did not quote that verse, which says, isn't it written in your scripture that you are gods? So people who are also referred to as gods. So obviously you don't say that these individuals are gods, rather they are those who do God's work. So on that behest, that would also be nominal to Christ. So I'm not sure if I'm just overstepping my boundary as the host, but as we don't have anyone coming up, I'm just having a little dialogue going forward. But I'd like to bring Nizam onto this particular issue we've been discussing. Would you like to highlight any points over here particularly?
Well, if I can...
Yes, so in reference to the Psalms 90 verse 2, I didn't previously address that, but I've had the chance to look at the passage. It doesn't actually say, like at least in the ESV and also in the King James Bible, it doesn't say, before the mountains were created, you are. But in the ESV and the King James, it says, before the mountains were brought forth, you are God, or thou art God. So that's not exactly the same as before Abraham was I am. So I would say that's different.
I was referring to the Septuagint, the Greek translation that was most commonly used in the first century. I can read it in Greek if you want.
I'm just looking at the ESV and the King James.
That's based on the Hebrew.
Based on the
different language. Yeah, that's based on the Hebrew. So, but Jesus is referring to...
I'll check out and see what the Septuagint says as well with regards to Psalms 90 verse 2. But with regards to David calling Jesus my Lord and my God, you'll find a similar expression also used by David. Thomas calling Jesus my Lord and my God. You'll find something similar as well being used by King David in 1 Samuel chapter 24 verse 8. 1 Samuel 24 verse 8, where Jesus refers to Saul as my Lord, the King, and then David worships Saul, or he puts his face on the ground and pays his homage. Whereas Thomas doesn't do that with respect to Jesus. He says my Lord and my God, but he doesn't worship Jesus. So maybe that could be understood that Thomas is using the word my Lord and my God loosely, because in biblical language, both Lord and God can be used for others. Like, Abraham is called my Lord by his wife Sarah, and Theos is used in the example that Mustafa cited with regards to when Jesus quotes the Psalms at the Jews and says, "Is it not written in your law? I have said you are gods." And not just the Jews are called gods, but even you'll find that in the Psalms, the angels are referred to as Elohim, and also Moses as well is referred to as Elohim as well in Exodus chapter 7 verse 1, for example. I was just wondering, do you want to open up? Is there like questions like that people have, or
Yeah, I was
how should we do this?
It would be nice if people could come up and then, verbally, ask their questions. But if no one wants to come up at the moment, we do have a question here from Brother Mehdi Ahmadi. So questions for Daniel, essentially, and I do hope the questions are spread between the two panelists. So the question for Daniel is, how does he reconcile Christ as God, or him having any glory in comparison to the Father, when John 8:49 to 50 to 55 is rather clear? These are the earlier verses to I am. That's probably that's for Daniel.
Sure, and I think that the context again is vitally important to understand the passage properly. So I appreciate him referring to the context. So to look at the actual verses he mentions, Jesus answered in verse 49, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. But I do not seek my glory. There is one who seeks and judges. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death, ever. The Jews said to him, now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, and the prophets also. And he will and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste of death, ever. Surely you are not greater than our father Abraham, who died. The prophets died too. Whom do you make yourself out to be? Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. And you have not known him, but I know him. And if I say I do not know him, I will be a liar like you, for I do know him and keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Therefore, they picked up stones to throw at him. But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. So, yeah, he does talk about glory. And that's, again, something that you find similarly in John chapter 5. The Son brings glory to the Father. And this is throughout the New Testament as well. In Philippians 2, where it says that every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. That's, again, an allusion to the Old Testament, Isaiah 45, verse 23, where Jehovah says, every knee will bow to me and every tongue will confess to God. This is fulfilled when people bow and worship Jesus, and they do it to the glory of God the Father. Our worship of Jesus does not detract from the glory of God. We worship God and honor him by honoring the one who he sent, even as we honor the Father, which is exactly what Jesus said in John chapter 5, verse 23. Why didn't he say, I am the glory? I'm not too sure what that question means, to be honest. Like, what does it mean? What would it mean for him to say that anyway? Like, I mean, in Hebrews 1, verse 3, you have something very similar, where Jesus is called the outshining of the glory of the Father. But he didn't say it on which occasion. Are we talking about in John 8:58, when you'd expect him to say, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the glory of God, or something like that? I mean, I'm sure if he did say that, Muslims would find a way of saying that wasn't a claim to be God either. So I'm not really sure.
Yeah,
beyond that, I've given the exegesis of those verses. I think that's good. Why couldn't himself pardon if he was the same as the Father? Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very human Jesus. Yeah, 6 months apart from John. That was kind of my point. He actually was younger than John, but John the Baptist says that he existed before him. So that, I think, is probably the clearest case where John, the Gospel of John, shows that he undoubtedly believes in the pre-existence of Jesus. But that's just one point here. We have they show a very human Jesus? Yes, 100%. He was human and divine, both. Two natures, one person. I'm not sure what him pardoning is the point is there, because he does pardon sins. It's a very well-known text that Jesus says to the lame man, "Your sins are forgiven." They say, who can forgive sins but God alone? And he says, so that you may know that the Son of Man, the Son of Man, has power on earth to forgive sins. Get up and walk. And he does it. And they're amazed. So he did pardon sins. If he was the same as the Father, now the same as the Father in nature, yes, and as such he does have the same abilities. Not the same person as the Father, but the same God that the Father is. Some good points there, but I don't find them problematic at all.
Nizam, would you like to comment on? Sorry to interrupt you. Would you like to comment on that last question?
Yeah. So with regards to Jesus saying that if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It doesn't make sense if it's within the context of Jesus announcing to the Jews that he is God, or he is the one that was spoken about in Isaiah when he says, "I am God, besides me there's no other." Because you wouldn't expect, like in the Old Testament, for God to say that my glory means nothing if I glorify myself, or I am not seeking my own glory. But it makes sense within the context of Jesus being a messenger sent by God, him being God's chosen Messiah, that the Messiah is there to bring glory to God rather than to glory to himself alone. And also, just I want to highlight something that my friend Dennis from Facebook mentioned with regards to Psalms 90 verse 2. He said in the Septuagint, it's a different Greek word that's used, which is different from John's Gospel. So he says it's, I'm going to mispronounce this, but he says it's Ainos. Ainos, so which is different from what the gospel writer John writes as ego Amy. And also, just going back to that point about John the Baptist, when John the Baptist says that Jesus is the Lamb of God and that he comes to take away the sins of the world, and that he was before me because he's before me because he was before me. Another way of translating it, and this is how Anthony Buzzard had translated it. And yes, he's a Unitarian, but he's also a biblical scholar who taught at Atlanta Bible College. So in his translation, it's something like he ranks before me because he is superior to me. So he ranked before me because he's superior to me. Because if you look up the word superior, the Greek is prostons or something to this effect. So one of the meanings that is given in the Blue Letter Bible is it refers to rank or position. So before me can refer to pre-existence, which I accept. It can also mean that, but it can also mean in rank and status. So John the Baptist could be saying that Jesus ranks before me because he's superior to me.
I'm not rebutting you, Nizam.
It's fine. You can if you wish. It's fine.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to refer to what Dennis said, because he's got the wrong Greek word there. I'm sure it was a straightforward mistake. The word ionos means age, so it's. I mean, perhaps it would be easier if I just read the phrase in Greek. Genethanai kai pleisthenai tein gen kai tein oikumenein tu hore genethanai kai pleisthenai tein gen kai tein oikumenein. Okay, so what we have is the word ionos, heos to ionos su a. So that's age to age, you are. It's su a. That is you are, which corresponds with ego eimi. So it's the last two words in Psalm 90 verse 2 in the Septuagint. You've got the word ionos, which comes directly before su a. That just word means age. From age to age, you are.
It doesn't su a is not I am.
No, because
Or
Moses
Ego
isn't saying
Amy.
it's about himself. He's saying that it's about God. That it means you are.
So God is su a.
Yeah, God is. Moses says, from age to age, you are, right?
Okay.
When Jesus speaks about himself, he says, before Abraham was, I am. So Moses isn't saying I am. He's saying you are, because he's praying to God. Okay? But
well, there is in the Greek, and Moses didn't write it in the Greek. Assuming it's originally in Hebrew. And in the Hebrew, it does seem to say Elohim, like you are God.
Yeah, and you are God is translated as you are into Greek, right? And Jesus says in the Gospel of John, which was written in Greek, I am, to correspond with the Greek su a, you are, which is the translation of the Hebrew from age to age, you are God. So you've got three steps there. From age to age, you are God. From age to age, you are in Greek, to I am when Jesus says it, to correspond with the Greek translation.
I still feel it's a bit of a leap or a jump.
Yeah, the thing is, the earlier part of the verse, when he talks about the mountains became, he uses the word genethanai. They became, but from age to age, you are. This is what Moses says, translated into Greek, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what Jesus says is Abraham became, and this is the cool part, right? Abraham became, I am. So he's using the Greek terms that correspond with what's used in Psalm 90. The word become for Abraham, genethanai, and the words I am in place of you are, because he's talking about himself.
So in the Psalms, it's implied that in the Greek translation, it's implied that it refers to God, whereas in John, the ego eimi by itself doesn't mean anything, but it's implied that it's referring to him or he, as I understand it, within the context of Jesus claiming to be the Messiah. Because the same usage is also used in John chapter 4, verse 26. When Jesus professes to the woman, the Samaritan, that he's the Messiah.
Sorry, I think I zoned out a little there. But if you're saying, can it be used as a simple self-identification, such as when the blind man says it, and possibly when Jesus says it in John 4, sure, sometimes, depending on the context, but not in this context. That's what I'm saying.
I understand often picking up stones to stone Jesus would be understood to be blasphemy, but it could be understood in the sense that they are accusing him of falsely claiming to be the Messiah and not necessarily claiming to be God.
Since there's nobody else here, I don't see any harm in continuing the dialogue. You're clearly happy to do that, or at least just for now. I mean, I do have an early morning, but nevertheless, it's an interesting.
Yeah.
So let me just one thing I didn't refer to that I kind of wanted to refer to in our dialogue, but never got around to. In Acts, you have Gamaliel, right? And he refers to other claims to be Messiah. But there's no indication, either historically or in the New Testament, that even though they were false messiahs, it was understood to be blasphemous for them to say that they were the Messiah alone. He refers to Judas and the 300 people who followed him. And he actually says, leave these guys alone, leave the Christians alone and see what happens to them. But it's guys like the Apostle Paul who just wouldn't put up with that and insist that we must be put to death for our blasphemy until, of course, he converts. And Muslims and Christians are going to have a different understanding of the character of Paul. But I mean, it doesn't seem like Gamaliel has such a problem with somebody claiming to be the Messiah. It's just if he claims to be God?
Yes, I guess different Jews would answer this question differently. So you would have Gamaliel, who would be like more tolerant, and he would be of the view that, just, let them say what they want to say. Like, we don't have to agree with them, or we don't have to believe that, and eventually, they'll be punished or judged by God. But then you have other Jews that would see this as being, they're going to misguide people and lead people astray. And so it's important that we do something about it right now, rather than, people being misled into the fire. In John's Gospel, in John chapter 11, it makes mention how they had a meeting about Jesus, where many people believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And they feared that if this carries on, the Romans would eventually come and destroy the city. And so they decide that it's better if they have Jesus killed, so that it's better one man perishes rather than the entire nation. So I guess it depends on who you ask. It's the same in the Muslim community as well. Someone falsely claiming to be a prophet, there'll be Muslims like, just let the person be, and God will judge them on the day of judgment. But yeah, obviously, then there'll be other people who want to take the laws into their own hands and do something more radical or more extreme.
Yeah, I think that answers the question quite reasonably as well. Nazim's latter points, that even being referred to as the Messiah would cause them to think that this is a blasphemous statement within itself, due to the fact that they're already, like in John chapter 8, verse 40, looking to to give Jesus a hard time by him stating, and I'm paraphrasing, when he says that I'm a man who's been sent by God, yet you are determined to kill me. So it looks like they could use any pretext other than the claim of being God himself. And Nazam quite eloquently pointed out that even in, just say, the Muslim tradition as well, this would be a nominal point where some people, if one was to come forward and, God forbid, claim to be a prophet, some would say, as he's mentioned, just let them do as they will, because let God judge them. Or others will take exception and castigate them. So it does appear from this context that this has been the case, that the Jews who were already against him, who were already reluctant to accept him, his messiahship, as we've seen nominally, and they've taken exception to that because of the fact that even in his trial, they haven't got enough evidence that he's claimed to be God, and hence have simply stated, "Are you the Christ?" Which shows in itself that they are left at, they're flummoxed to present the evidence, and the evidence within itself has simply said that he's the Messiah, and that is what they took exception to. It's plausible. Do you think it's plausible, Daniel, what the explanation given?
I'll go this far. I think it is plausible that there were Jews who were very upset at the things Jesus had to say about them, like the Pharisees. He's openly accusing the Pharisees of being hypocrites. He's agitating them a lot, and he's drawing away followers from them. And yeah, they would have been happy to use excuses to get him into trouble, or even to try to get him killed. I think it's plausible to go that far only. I think the difficulty comes, and it's fine to attribute diversity to the Jewish community as well. The difficulty comes in when we look at what Jesus says about himself in response to these kinds of accusations. He doesn't attempt to distance himself from it. Instead, he makes bigger claims than the things they're reacting to. And that's what I think we really need to pay attention to. They say, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" If he said, "I never said I saw Abraham. I said he rejoiced to see my day. There's prophecies about me." But he didn't do that, did he? He says, "Before Abraham was, I am." That's the way he responds when people do this. He takes it to a whole higher level than the accusations that are being made. Not so when he's being accused of, for example, political rebellion. He stands before Pilate, and Pilate says, "Are you making yourself out to be a king?" Which is an accusation like, "Are you saying that you're a king in competition with Caesar? We're supposed to be ruling here." And he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom was of this world, my people would be fighting so that I wasn't delivered over to you." he even resists actively when it goes and hides because people want to make him a king. Like, he's capable of making himself known when he wants to disagree with what's being said about him. I do not have a demon, straight out. But that's not what it's like when they attribute divine claims to him. They pick up on a hint that he gives, and he makes that hint clearer and clearer until we're left with the Bible that we've got. So I agree to a degree, but only so far.
But I mean, if it is plausible, then you would assume the context will determine to some extent what they will be up to, you see. That would be the nominal understanding. The context will determine. So if they can't find any justification that he's claimed to be God in a literal way based upon Mark 62, therefore concocted this other understanding that he's claimed to be the Messiah, that in itself is evidence that he should be brought up for trial, then you can understand that they will make up things against him in order to do away with him. And these are the examples that are set forth. And one more quick, because we've had no one really come up and ask questions, which we would have preferred. I mean, according to the Hebrew, I mean, as I'm sure you're very much aware, the Hebrew understanding of this verse from Exodus 3:14 states, meaning I will be who I will be. So the actual translation is totally mixed up. And we've only got this in the Greek Septuagint as I am. So what would you say in regards to that? I mean, the understanding nominally is it's not even cited. This verse from Abraham, before Abraham was I am, making reference to Exodus 3:14. In the Hebrew, there is no citation as such that the term I am is used. Simply it says, I will be who I will be. It's like God telling Moses to tell the Jews, never mind what my name is, or simply tell them I will be who I will be, or mind your own business. That's the type of etymology being used to. So what would you say in regards to that, when the original Hebrew is making mention of something completely different?
Yeah, so for starters, the meaning of the Hebrew, whether it's I am that I am or I will be what I will be, that is debated among Hebrew scholars. There are arguments being made on both sides, good scholars on both sides. They're both, people on both sides are much better than I am. So I personally lean towards I am that I am, having looked at the arguments that I've seen from both sides. But you are completely right in the sense that the Greek translation of that in the Septuagint is ego eimi haon, which Jesus did not say in John 8:58. Whether, a Christian could make the case that he was referring to the Hebrew without the Greek there or something, but as I said in my closing statement, it's a weak case because the Greek text doesn't agree with it. The Greek text could be wrong. You can make that argument, but the Hebrew can go either way. The Greek did not go in a way that corresponds with John 8:58, and as a response, I would discourage Christians from using that particular argument because I don't think it's a very strong argument. And I think we have much, much better arguments, such as the ones that I did present tonight. I wouldn't use that argument, and I don't think anybody else should either at this point.
Thank you very much. Nazar, would you like to add something to that point?
Yeah, I mean, with regards to the Jews misunderstanding Jesus, which is a common theme throughout John's Gospel, and Jesus not correcting them, this is also common as well, that Jesus doesn't correct them because they are not of his sheep. So, for example, in the same chapter in John chapter 8, verse number 43, Jesus says, "Why do you not understand what I say? Is it because you cannot bear to hear my words?" So even if Jesus clarified to them that he hasn't seen Abraham, they will nonetheless still misconstrue what he said, because Jesus says, you are the children of the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning and the father of lies, and your desire is to do the will of your father, who is the devil. And he does say in the same chapter as well that you who seek to kill me, a man who spoke the truth which I heard from God. So here Jesus is claiming to be a man. And he's not claiming
Of course,
to be God.
and he says that Abraham did not do this. Yeah, and he says Abraham did not do this. You're seeking to kill me, a man who's told you the truth from God. This Abraham did not do. So you got to wonder when Abraham had the chance.
Exactly. Abraham didn't seek to kill
18,
anyone, especially a messenger who claims to have words from God. Whereas the Jews are seeking to kill Jesus, who is claiming to be a man who heard a revelation given to him by God. Because even in John chapter 7, verses 16 and 17, Jesus says, the words you hear are not my words, or my teachings are not my teachings or my doctrines, but the one who sent me. And if you knew the will of God, then you would know whether I speak from myself or whether I speak from God.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I'm going to be trying to get some sleep about now. But I appreciate the conversation with you all, and hope to hear from you again sometime.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your sentiments, and we don't want to keep you from getting your good night's sleep, particularly as you may have to go to work.
Yeah, I've got an early morning, so yeah.
Okay,
no worries.
Thank you so much for appearing.
It's been great to be here, though, and I appreciate your help.